I'm here with Howard Gardner, and Howard, we've known each other for years and years. I think since graduate school at Harvard, we overlapped. Thank you for joining me.
Always a pleasure to see you.
Howard, you had an unexpected 15 minutes or more of fame with multiple intelligence, the theory you're most closely identified with, when you wrote your 1983 book, Frames of Mind. 13 years later, I had the same experience with emotional intelligence, which was an unexpected attention getter too. There's a very important connection between my work and your work, and that I consciously built on the path that you had laid, which was the idea that there are ways of being effective, of being intelligent, of producing a product which is valued, that have nothing to do with academic intelligences, with the verbal and math and spatial abilities that are cultivated in school. And in emotional intelligence, the theory that I was writing about, which actually was developed by Peter Salovine and Jack Mayer, which I then subsequently took in another direction, was really an unpacking of two of your seven intelligences, the intrapsychic and the interpersonal. Self-awareness and self-mastery and empathy and relationship skills. However, there's a very interesting distinction between how you have followed through on this and how you approached it and how I approached it. You're someone who was there at the beginning of cognitive psychology. Your first book was really about cognitive science. And you have looked at minds and continue to look at minds, which is a cognitive lens. When I wrote Emotional Intelligence, I was wanting to find a framework that would describe affective neuroscience. I've always been interested in the emotions. And so I was looking at the emotional level. It seemed to me that our two theories are enormously complementary in that way. Have you thought about that?
I think that's a very good point. I remember initially when I first wrote Emotional Intelligence, thinking, as you've implied, that this isn't as cognitive as I think about things. One of the things that I said, in fact, at the end of my book about cognitive science was it didn't deal with context and it didn't deal with emotions. And they were both kind of taboo. And you were really ready to jump right into that water. I have to say that in that sense, you were more prescient because while you may have had intimations of affective neuroscience in the middle 1990s, it of course has become huge in the succeeding period. This is something which I'm quite satisfied with, but it's not something that was on my radar screen at the time. And the other thing, I'm always asked about the relationship between the theory, and it's too boring for me to say, well, I think it's great. So I always point out that I try very hard to be completely neutral about how intelligences are used. So somebody has a lot of interpersonal, or to use your term, social intelligence. They can use it to manipulate people, or they can use it to mediate and to get them to cooperate. Exactly. And I think when you write about emotional and social intelligence, there is, I would say, a patina of positivity about it, even though I'm sure you recognize that people can use those manipulative kinds of ways.
Actually, when I wrote Social Intelligence, which is the interpersonal domain, I had a chapter on the dark triad, narcissists, Machiavellians, and sociopaths. And as I think you've pointed out, the distinction is ethics. Do you have an ethical writer or not? And that gets us to leadership and the need for an ethical writer. One of your minds in your 5 Minds book is an ethical mind. Do you see that as a sine qua non for a leader?
When I wrote about multiple intelligence initially, I took great care not to confound the kind of people I wanted us to be with the way the intelligence worked. So then in my more recent work called Good Work, I've atoned for this, because a person can't be a good worker unless they are ethical, unless they try to do the the right thing. When it comes to leadership, you have the same fault line. And any history of the 20th century would have to consider people like Hitler and Mao and Stalin extremely effective leaders. They got their way, they changed history. But if your definition of leader is what does it mean to be a good leader in the sense of a leader we want to have, then the absence of an ethical compass is a disaster. And I don't think we can afford to have a lot of ethics-free leaders anymore because the stakes are so enormous.
Absolutely. And can you tie that back to the multiple intelligence framework? Which of those intelligences are most germane to ethical leadership?
Well, I think that leaders in general need to have linguistic intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, some intrapersonal, you and I could argue about that, and what I call existential intelligence. Linguistic intelligence, because at least until today, being able to tell your story effectively is important. Interpersonal, because if you are on the Asperger's spectrum, you don't know how people are going to react to what you say, you're not going to be effective. You have to have some understanding about yourself, but I'm not sure you need to be obsessive about it. I think Ronald Reagan was a very successful leader who didn't spend any appreciable time trying to probe his psychic depths. And then existential intelligence, which is kind of an honorific intelligence. It doesn't really pass my 8 criteria, but it's an interesting thing to think about, is the ability to deal with big questions and help people find meaning in their lives. And whenever we talk about leaders who go beyond the managerial category, leaders who actually move people to do and think and behave in ways they wouldn't before, they need to be able to give us a view of the big picture. What's it all about? Where are we going? And so on. Now, the truth is you could have all of those intelligences and still be a real bastard. I mean, Reverend Jim Jones moves people, but he moves people to get them to kill themselves. That's existential intelligence. So the ethics is where you say to yourself, what's the right thing to do in the long run? And what's the right thing to do in a transparent way? So you aren't doing it secretly, but you're open about it. And if you both think about the long run and are transparent about it, it's very hard to be unethical. The difficult thing, I believe, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, is that in contemporary society, we have to occupy roles which we didn't evolve to be able to occupy. One role is the role of a worker in the sense of being a professional, a doctor, lawyer, accountant, journalist, whatever. And the other is a role of a citizen, and not being somebody who lives in the neighborhood, but somebody who has to deal with how do you vote for your city, your state, and since we now can bring disease or pollution to the rest of the world, what kind of a global citizen are you? And we can't rely on the 10 Commandments or on the Golden Rule to tell us about what it means to be a good professional, what it means to be a good citizen. So I make a very sharp distinction between neighborly morality, which is how do Dan and I, who live in the same block and play football with one another, how do we deal with one another? We've got a lot of help from evolution on that. And then what happens when I'm a doctor or a teacher and I'm faced with a very difficult ethical dilemma, or when I'm voting on some kind of a candidate or on some kind of a resolution, or deciding, whether I should undertake a business which might ultimately have negative impacts far away in a long time. These are ethical issues, and we don't have a lot of help with those. So in a book I recently wrote, I talk about the need of creating a commons. And by that I mean an area where people who are in the same profession or people who are citizens in the same polity can actually talk about the ethical dilemmas which we encounter, what we did, where things went wrong, what we might do better next time.
Could that be done in an organization or a company?
Sure. And with the internet, it could be done with any group that you want to do it. And yes, no, I think organizations need to heal themselves. And unless people are honest and transparent about the problems they went into, how they try to deal with them, recognizing they don't always do a good job, but maybe they've learned some lessons, or maybe some other people have learned some lessons. I mean, you worked for many years at the New York Times. The New York Times has got lots of problems with it, but it certainly is a professional organization. And over the 100+ years of the New York Times, there are dozens and dozens of lessons that people have learned about what to do when something goes wrong, when you get a story wrong, when you misquote somebody, when you don't report weapons of mass
destruction. There are actually very strong norms. And now there's actually an ombudsman whose role is to make transparent things most readers probably don't notice.
Sure. And ever since the debacle of the early part of the 21st century, which was both the failure with the weapons of mass destruction in the Jason Blair case, there's now a public editor which exposes those issues to the world, which would not even have known about them 50 years ago.
But Howard, the Times is very unusual in that regard, in having the conscience, if you will, to have a public editor. Most companies don't. Most companies try to paper over things. How would a commons? Yes. How would a commons work? What are the ground rules of a commons?
The commons will need to involve at least the people within the particular entity, whether it's a newspaper or a corporation or a school. And then there has to be an agreement upon ground rules. One of the questions is, can everybody in that organization participate? To what extent is it confidential, that it isn't spread widely? Can you submit things anonymity? And that calls for what now people now call curating. And the curator, like the public editor, has to be quite clear about what he or she is doing, when they will allow anonymity, when something is on the record or when it's off the record, and so on. And the record needs to be kept up to date, in a sense that if there are lessons which people have learned, they have to be called on. I guess I haven't thought of it before. It's like common law in the commons. You don't invent things from scratch. Some years ago, the dean of admission at MIT was found to have lied about her own credentials for decades. And so she was summarily fired. And to me, this was a no-brainer. You can't be judging the credentials of thousands of people each year if you yourself aren't honest about your own. In a group of students at a very good liberal arts school in New England, we didn't get a single student who thought that this person should be fired. They divided between, well, she's doing a good job, what's the problem? And, well, everybody lies on their resume. And this was a wake-up call to me that we cannot assume that an ethical standard, which may be obvious to somebody who comes out of a certain background, is going to be obvious to a new generation. And I think that's probably a very important part of leadership too. Without being a schoolmarm about it, one has to be able to provide reasons and examples for people who are growing up in a very different milieu. I mean, we've been looking via the digital media at 5 issues which we might say people of a certain age would have views on: sense of identity, privacy, ownership, authorship, trustworthiness and credibility, and participation in community. And the more you look at these things, the more you see they've been totally transformed because of the internet, the web, social media, virtual reality, Twitter, you name it. You can't think about intellectual property in the same way when it's so easy to transpose and to aggregate for yourself almost anything. What's trustworthiness and credibility when even if you send something privately, it can be reproduced and sent to others? What is privacy, indeed? As we're speaking, there's now a big debate between the United States and Europe, where Europe says web stuff should be automatically deleted after a certain period of time because otherwise your privacy is deleted. In America, people say privacy, get over it. So the leader cannot assume that ethical norms in one era can simply be transplanted en bloc to another era.
That's very troubling because companies can be torpedoed by unethical behavior. Certainly leaders, we read almost weekly or monthly of some leader, political leader or business leader whose career is ended because of ethical lapse.
But it's how much more often, Dan, is it because they try to hide it rather than confronting it? I mean, I read the newspaper pretty carefully, and I would say of 100 of these ethical boo-boos in the course of a couple of years, you have maybe at the most one resignation on the basis of principle, the Japanese model, I did wrong and there I'm going to resign. And you have maybe a half a dozen out of 100 where people say, it was wrong, we're sorry we did it, these are the steps we're going to take, and I'm going to start with myself, I'm going to cut myself salary or whatever. And then you've got 90-some examples of people first hiding it, and then it comes out and it gets worse and worse. And you wonder, when do people learn that the cover-up is always more damning in the long run than the effort to come clean and to say we're going to do better? And that's part of the idea of a commons, is everybody does stuff wrong. I know as a professor, I've been a professor forever, I've done dozens of wrong things. Is it better for me to hide and try to pretend it didn't happen, or to be quite open about it. Doesn't mean I have to call you up as a reporter and say, this is what I did, but I ought to be talking to my colleagues and my students and trying to learn from those.
But then aren't you an exemplar as a leader about how to handle ethical lapses? What I'm wondering is, can you go a little more deeply into the kind of behaviors that, or what leaders can do that will help socialize people?
Absolutely. Leaders need to be very clear up front about what is acceptable and what is not. Number two, in their own behavior, they have to be punctilious about observing those kinds of things. And it helps if they give all sorts of humanizing aspects, like eating in the same dining room, parking in the same lot, spending some time walking around and schmoozing. But then here's where the rubber hits the road. When there are violations, they have to be recognized, penalized. It doesn't mean everybody gets fired the first time that they do it, but they have to be clear consequences. And one of the most awful things, which really, I think, decimates the nonprofit world, is the secrecy around a chastisement or a fire, where everybody gives a bullshit story of why the person was let go. And indeed, it should be exactly the opposite. You know, Dan Goleman was a great reporter, but the second time he created a quote out of thin air, he was let go. And let that be a lesson on you, because we cannot be a respected newspaper if people create quotations out of thin air or take them off the web.
So you're saying that it's better to go public with the lapse, because that is a lesson for everyone else.
Well, I think I'd have to do that on a case-by-case basis. I mean, there are people's careers and lives ahead of them, and I'm not sure if you're working for Dunkin' Donuts and you do something unethical, that ought to be something that I then call up the New York Times. If you're the chief damn state, the New York Times should know it, because otherwise you just end up running Starbucks instead.
I mean, if you're the CEO?
Yes, right. Or
You have a lot of fiduciary responsibility, and that is a different order of magnitude. I mean, do the same rules apply to the C-suite as to levels, front lines?
I think they ought to apply especially to the C-suite. And when you read in the newspaper about boards of directors, which are chums of those executives and where they keep raising each other's rewards, it's less nauseating. And yet, Dan, this has become so much the norm in the United States that people don't even think about it anymore. And it would be laughable in many other societies, or in our own society 50 years ago.